Somnacanth, the soporific siren, is one of the monsters introduced in Monster Hunter Rise, an aggressive amphibious leviathan that can be found in the flooded forests, frost islands, and lava caverns. With so many of Rise's monsters inspired by the indigenous yokai superstitions and tales of Japan, Somnacanth pulls its first great deception by being the only new monster in the game's roster that does not draw inspiration from Japanese myth and legend. Well, until Sunbreak comes out, but as of writing it is the only one. Fortunately for my purposes, Somnacanth's inspiration does not need much of a deep dive to explore. Many of its inspirations and cues are written into its very descriptions, items, and extra content, and mostly take from Western mermaids. Whilst Japan does have its own form of mermaids, and multiple forms of them as well, they tend not to be the compelling sirens or beauties that are so often depicted in Western media. Indeed, as the game's director points out, they tend to be quite monstrous beasts with the upper half of devils, demons, and other such creatures that could all make for fine monster design all of their own. So whilst this video shall primarily be focusing on the Western tradition, I'll endeavour to cover the ningyo in sufficient detail as well, although I do have plans to cover them in depth for another video someday. So let's take a dive and see in what ways and to what degree mermaids have inspired the soporific siren of Monster Hunter Rise. Mermaids have a somewhat odd history, because they have independently arisen as a concept multiple times across history in multiple places across the world with completely different legends between them. The first story, as in written down, of a mermaid is from the ancient Assyrian legends about the goddess Accreditations, who transformed herself into a mermaid and fled to the sea in shame for accidentally killing her lover. And even before that, there were depictions of mermen and less frequently mermaid-like figures that have been in Mesopotamian artwork from somewhere around 1600 BC. It's extremely likely that mermaids, or at least figures half man, half fish, have existed in oral tradition for even longer, although it's extremely difficult to put a number onto how long such stories have been around, and I'm most certainly not the anthropologist who could attempt to backtrace them to do so. It has been suggested that some historical reports of mermaids have been taken from marine mammals and fish. Indeed, Christopher Columbus reports of meeting 3 mermaids in 1493, which have been attributed to manatees, and the scientific name for the order to which manatees belong, Sirenia, comes from these mythological beings. But that aside, the mermaids of today, or the modern interpretation, did not start with Mesopotamian carvings or distraught goddesses, but rather from Homer's Odyssey and the Sirens. For those who did not grow up reading tales of Greek mythology or had to read the text as part of their education, the Sirens are a group of half-bird, half-women monsters that dwell on islands in the Mediterranean Sea, surrounded by rocks and cliffs. They sing enchantingly and, in some tales, even have some control over the winds, and use those charms and voices to draw passing sailors to dash their boats and themselves upon the rocks of their island, where they then descend to feed and devour them, sometimes alive, sort of like a musical anglerfish drawing its prey in even closer. Over time, the image of the sirens changed from being half bird to half fish. Certainly by early Christian times, handwritten bestiaries with entries for sirens would often depict what we would call mermaids, with the beautiful and compelling singing voice remaining as one of their key features. In this form, many of the key aspects of mermaids have remained since, and throughout Europe their depiction as temptresses who lure sailors onto rocks with their voices has persisted, and also spawned many regional variants, some of which are only tangentially related or have been heavily adapted into pre-existing superstition, like the Undine, Melusine, Lorelei, and even the sealskin-wearing Selkies of the Hebrides. In contrast to Western mermaids, and as mentioned earlier, the Japanese ningyo is a creature that isn't exactly physically attractive. They tend to have the upper bodies of devils or simply be large fish ranging in the size of a human child to a large seal with a human-like face. I imagine they're very uncanny valley, and they certainly are in a lot of their drawings. Perhaps one of the most notable thing about ningyo is their flesh. In many stories, the consumption of it will render a person immortal, although the ningyo itself may also place a terrible curse on any fisherman who captures it or tries to eat it. Such curses can often destroy entire towns or bring about terrible natural disasters. Immortality with a great price, it seems. One of Somnacanth's titles is the Mermaid Wyvern, which is as on-the-nose and direct a link as one can make, and puts even Gosharag's Snow Oni Beast title to shame. These are the kanji that are used to write Somnacanth's name in Japanese, and once broken down they quite literally mean human fish dragon. There's little I really need to say to really analyse that with any depth at all, though it's worth noting that the first two kanji are identical to the one that constitute ningyo as well. Interesting how the identical meaning of the words can mean two completely different creatures, isn't it? Somnacanth itself, while seeming an odd name of little relation, actually does have relevance as well. Somna is a Swedish word that means to sleep. Considering the monster's use of its powder, this certainly makes sense, as that is what the development team was going for, rather than some manner of mind-altering status effect to represent a mermaid leading a victim astray into their doom. Somewhat pleasantly, although likely unrelated, Somna is also an Urdu word, sometimes used as a girl's name, which means moonlight. And seeing how in Somnacanth's monster description it's mentioned to crest on moonlit nights, well, it's quite apropos, I think. I certainly hope it was a factor in the formation of its name. Finally, the canth part of its name comes from the ancient Greek akantha, meaning spine, which is used as an affix in taxonomy to create species names, most famously in the living fossil coelacanth, the hollow spine. Considering how Somnacanth can launch spines at hunters and the descriptions of them on its frill, it's only fitting, really. When it comes to Somnacanth's design, there's only a little to look at from the Western view of mermaids. Its enormous head crest is intended, from a design standpoint, to evoke the long flowing hair so often depicted as being possessed by mermaids. But that's where the similarities pretty much end, really. Somnacanth's body plan, being a leviathan, possesses plenty of anatomical features that are frankly not found on Western mermaids, like legs. In terms of physical design, Somnacanth borrows much more heavily from the ningyo. As the director put it, Somnacanth has the upper body of a devil far more than a beautiful woman. Ningyo are sometimes depicted not as fish with human faces, but with a vaguely humanoid upper half and a pair of arms. Although this depiction is more of a modern thing, developing since Japan opened up after the Edo period and Western contact increased. Even in this more humanoid form, ningyo tend to have a body that's covered in thick scales, which sounds far more like Somnacanth to me. Also, Somnacanth's face might be vaguely humanoid by monster standards, but it's hardly what one could call beautiful, even if you had a couple of drinks under your belt. And whilst Western mermaids are typically enchanting, ningyo are often described as hideously ugly. Whilst it's not Somnacanth's singing that is the main threat the hunter will face whilst hunting it, it is certainly one of the things that the local people of Komura village first think of when they think of Somnacanth. At least if we take the poems, haiku and song that appear in monster introduction cinematics as the sort sung at gatherings to entertain or inform locals about the local flora and fauna of the world. Quite specifically, Somnacanth's cinematic speaks of the song having a seducing quality that leads to the destruction of the listener, not unlike the many, many examples of mermaids luring sailors to their doom, leading all the way back to Homer's sirens. Of course, in-game, Somnacanth's roars do little more than stun the player for a moment rather than having some additional effect, which is probably a mercy to anyone who's ever had to fight those few monsters whose roars actually have an effect on the hunter beyond making them cover their ears. When it comes to the equipment for Somnacanth, we have the Great Sword mentioning the bewitching aura of the weapon, calling upon the compelling song and features of mermaids and sirens, whilst the frilled claw and illusory frilled blow both mention dragging or pulling those attacked by it down into the sea, with the accompanying image of never being seen again and dying horrific death in the crushing darkness of the ocean. Finally, both the frilled blow and illusory frilled blow make mention of different mermaid legends in some way, with the former mentioning mermaids in particular, and the latter doing the same for the nereids, ancient Greek spirits that are often conflated with mermaids. Finally, a mention of the parts that we can carve from Somnacanth. The Somnacanth Shell Plus mentions how it lures in victims with its beauty before crushing them, an obvious reference to the vindictive and predatory mermaid tradition, but bizarrely the opposite is presented in the form of the Somnacanth sedative, which goes with the more romantic recent tradition of depicting a longing creature that weeps and mourns, like the Lorelei of 19th century German poetry and art. And there we have it, the soporific siren of Rise and its links to the Western mermaid and the Japanese ningyo. Perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of this all is how Somnacanth's description, name, and weapons all have the unintended effect of making mermaids a thing in the world of Monster Hunter. Whether they are identical to those Western mermaids of our world, more akin to the ningyo, or an entirely separate myth, the people of Komura Village at least have similar legends, and it's frankly fascinating and raises all manner of questions all of its own. In the ancient past, perhaps a Somnacanth body washed ashore and was found by locals, or perhaps first-hand accounts of live specimens have inspired legends that have become mermaids. Or were these legends pre-existent, and the Somnacanth holds a position not unlike the manatee in the real world, albeit one that's far more dangerous to the sailors and people of Komura? If Somnacanth features in future games or content, maybe we'll discover the truth, but between the legends associated with Somnacanth and the monk snail, it seems that the sailors of the world in Monster Hunter are just as superstitious as those of the real world.